What's up, guys? Welcome to part 5 in our 8-part series on God as the best explanation of blank. Hey, this one is so different than the other ones in structure that you might notice that the layout looks different, that things have been shaken up a little bit. Yeah, I'm owning that this is a unique argument, and so I'm giving it a unique structure that kind of goes through a lot of my own personal experience while I was studying this and the way that it made sense in my own brain. Like, what you might recall is that this episode is already a week behind. I had to put up a different training last week because this is just such a huge topic, and I wanted to do my due diligence in understanding the conversation that I'm going to be relaying to you. And honestly, this is something that I will probably continually be studying probably for years to come, to be honest. But I do think that I got a good enough grasp on it to where I can present the general argument and the perspective. And I think you're going to be kind of blown away by some of the things that I say. I think some of them are going to be trivial, but some of them are going to be like, oh, whoa. So with that being said, let's get into it. God is the best explanation of the intentional states of consciousness in the world. All right, so the argument looks as follows. Premise 1, if God did not exist, intentional states of consciousness would not exist. Or you could rephrase that and say, if God does not exist, then intentional states of consciousness do not exist. Premise 2, intentional states of consciousness do exist. Conclusion, therefore, God exists. So let's start. I'm going to actually reverse this. I'm going to talk about premise 2 first, then I'm going to talk a whole lot about I'm going to talk about premise 1 first. I'm going to talk a whole lot about premise 2, and then I'm going to talk about premise 1 a little bit more. So that's going to be the flow, but we're going to spend most of our time today actually talking about premise 2. So, premise 1, on naturalism, all apparent thought or states of consciousness is nothing more than chemical and electrical outputs in the brain. It says that even though I perceive as though I'm thinking, the only thing that's really happening is that neurons in my brain are firing. So, in that sense, it's saying that the mind is not a distinct object from the brain. And so that's the truth on naturalism. That's the truth on atheism. So if God does not exist, then intentional states of consciousness do not exist. The reality is, in fact, all that it actually exists is this illusion of consciousness, which has all sorts of radical implications. So let's dig into some of that. But that's all I'm going to say about premise 1 right now. We're going to go back to it in a minute. Premise 2 is actually the harder one to defend. And it might seem like the more obvious one, but when we get into it, when you realize that the argument is against the idea that all of our perceived consciousness is actually just an illusion based on firing of brain synapses, then you realize that premise 2 actually becomes relatively difficult to defend. Let's start talking about premise 2. Okay, so the argument of the naturalist must be that the mind and the brain are actually the same thing. So we're going to have a conversation about if that's plausibly true. Entity A is identical to entity B if and only if whatever is true about A is also true about B and vice versa. Everything that's true about A must be true about B. Everything that's true about B must be true about A. Everything that's false about A must be false about B. And everything that's false about B must be false about A. That's what it needs to mean for A and B to actually be identical. Okay, to actually be the same thing. So with that, here's what identical doesn't mean. Okay, identical doesn't mean that causation and constant correlation, neither of those imply identity. Okay, neither causation nor constant correlation implies identicality. Neither of those say that it's the same thing. So you could say that one causes the other. A causes B. That doesn't mean that A and B are the same thing. Or you could say that A and B are always together. That doesn't mean that they're the same thing. Let me give you an example. Take a triangle. Okay, this is a triangle or a trilateral. The definition for triangle, triangular, means that it is a shape that has exactly 3 angles. Compare that to trilateral, which is a shape which has exactly 3 straight sides. Notice, a shape is triangular if and only if it is trilateral. But the property of having 3 sides is not identical to the property of having 3 angles, even though they are constantly conjoined. What do I mean they're not identical? Well, they're identical if what is true about A is always true about B, right? A is the property of having three angles. B is the property of having three sides. Is having three sides the same thing as having three angles? No. But they do always come together in shapes, right? So just because two things are constantly conjoined does not mean that they are the same thing. It doesn't mean that they're actually identical, right? So where this conversation matters for us is a conversation about the brain versus the mind, right? Now, you could say that all of everything we know about the brain can be simplified to a conversation about chemical and physical interactions. We can say that there's the firing of the neurons inside the brain, and this causes all of these things. And we could say that every single time a certain synapse fires, this is the result in our consciousness, right? And we could see that we could construct a one-to-one correlation, and we could say this causes this, or they always happen together, or they're conjoined. But the question is, are they actually the same thing? Right? So let's have a conversation about the things about them. Are they the same thing? We could show that the brain and the mind are two different things if we could find anything that is true about one of them that is not true about the other. So, well, I found a few for you. First, we can say that the brain, everything about the brain can be described by physical events. So physical events are happenings in the brain and central nervous system that can be described exhaustively using terms from chemistry and physics. In contrast, the mind is mental events. Mental events are things like thoughts, feelings of pain, or episodes of having a sensory experience. They, in contrast, are not definable through terms of chemistry and physics. So let's see if these things stack up. So here's something that's true about the brain that is not true about the mind. Okay? Any single element of the brain, any neuron, any transaction, anything that occurs in the brain is something that happens between physical matter and therefore has physical weight. But mental events, things like thoughts, carry no physical weight. So since they have no physical weight, but everything that happens in the brain does have physical weight, we have found one thing that shows that the mind and the brain are not the same thing. And why am I giving a list? I'm going to give you kind of a long list. Why am I giving a list? Because everything could be reasonably argued against as a misunderstanding and things of that nature. And rather than digging into the weeds the same way that I did over the last 2 weeks, I'm just going to show you guys all of the things that the materialist has to believe. And I think you're going to agree with me that there's no way that you could believe these things. Okay. Secondly, anything that happens in the brain, any brain event, is something that has a physical location. But notice, when I think about eating pizza, or when I think any thought at all, but when I think about eating pizza, that thought does not have a physical location. Now you could say that the firing in the brain of the neurons in the brain happens at a physical location. That's the brain event. But the mind event, does that happen in a specific location? I think not. And I think our experience tells us that that doesn't have a central location. Now here's another one. So everything that happens in the brain is composed of chemicals. But thoughts are not composed of chemicals. Mind events are not composed of chemicals. Everything that happens in the brain, or most everything that happens in the brain, includes electrical properties, right? The firing of synapses is electrical signals, right? Thoughts are not comprised of electrical properties, right? Mind events are not comprised of electrical properties. So here we've already found 4 ways that the brain and the mind must be different things. They're not identical. Here's the big one. Things of the brain, physical events, are not self-presenting, but things of the mind are self-presenting. What do I mean by that? Well, take any material substance in the entire universe, and an observer can look on and they can learn about it. They can study it, right? You could open up my skull and you could study my brain if you wanted to. But those things are things in which an observer must somehow interact with their senses to get data about, right? We have to interact with them. They're not self-presenting. Self-presenting things are things that you have an awareness of without necessitating any interaction. And they're things that others cannot observe, right? So you could look at my brain and you could see everything that my brain is doing, but you could not know whether or not I was thinking about the color red, right? You can't know my actual mental experiences, no matter how much observation you do. And I think this is the big one in so many ways. You can't know what I am thinking. And interestingly enough, this is self-evident to me, but any specialist could know more about my brain than I know about my brain, right? You can know more about my body, any part of my body, than I do, but you can't know more about my thoughts than I do. Isn't that interesting? In fact, the only way you could possibly know anything about my thoughts would be if I, as an eyewitness, give a testimony to you about my thoughts. And that's often what neuroscientists will do when they're studying the brain, is they will ask the subjects what thoughts they're having and try to find the correlations between the mind and the brain. So that is one obvious way in which the mind and the brain are necessarily different things. Here, let me give you a thought experiment. I think this is going to make the point very clear. Okay. This is kind of a famous thought experiment. Imagine that there is a girl who is trapped in a room where everything in that room is black and white. There is no color. She's trapped in this room from birth. She herself has no color. She is, from birth, perpetually put through rigorous training and studying, and she's given all of the literature on the concept of color. She can tell you everything about color from a naturalistic perspective. She can tell you everything about the light waves, how they reflect off of objects, and how our brains, how our eyes perceive them, how they translate it to the brain. She can tell you every little detail that is known under the sun about what color is. But she's never seen it. Then imagine she's given a red apple. Does she learn something new? If you said yes, then you're not a materialist. If you said yes, then you believe that the mind is something different than the brain, because you believe that it's not just about the physical properties. There's something else about the experiential properties. She learned new information. Here, let me give you another similar example. Imagine that a gentleman is born deaf. He in his entire life never hears anything, but he seeks to study sound. And he learns all about sound waves. And he learns so much about it that he becomes the world's leading expert. He knows more about sound than anybody in history ever has. And he knows so much about sound that he finds a way to make it to where he can experience sound. Before he experiences sound, does he know everything about sound? Or is he missing something because he's never heard it? And these examples point out that when you're only talking about material, there's something missing. We know this experientially. We know there's something more to us and more to experience. There's more to reality than that which can be explained with chemistry and physics. You might have noticed that nothing that I've said so far is actually the headline here of intentional states of consciousness. Maybe you didn't, because maybe you're not quite sure on what intentional states of consciousness is. Well, that's the last one here. The brain and physical material has no intentionality, but the mind has intentionality. What is intentionality? Intentionality is the ability of the mind, or thoughts particularly, to be of something or about something, right? I think of pepperoni pizza. I think about the things that I did last week, right? So this is something that's unique to consciousness. And what do I mean by that? I mean, no physical material thing has the ability to be about something else, to be of something else. A chair can't be about a desk. It can be close to a desk, but it can't be about a desk, because it just doesn't make any sense, right? But my thoughts can be about my wife, and I can be close to my wife in proximity, right? This is what intentionality is. It's the ability of the mind to think about and of other things. Physical matter can't do this. Chairs can't do this. Houses can't do this. Hunks of tissue can't do this. Hunks of tissue like the brain can't do this. The brain and the mind must be two separate things. What we've shown is that the brain is not equal to the mind. But that necessarily means that the mind exists outside of the brain. Now, they could be so tightly correlated as with triangles, with the definition of triangular and trilateral. They could be that tightly correlated. I'm not arguing that they're not, but I am arguing that they're still different things. They exist in a different realm. And the physicalist, the materialist, the naturalist, the atheist must assert, because this is an immaterial entity, that it's an illusion. And that means, going back to those slides, all of these things are something that the atheist has to reject. You have to reject the idea that thoughts are self-presenting. You have to say that they're illusions. You have to reject the idea of intentionality. You have to say that it's an illusion. You have to reject everything that I've talked about in order to affirm atheism. You need to reject the idea that the brain and the mind are separate. Why? Well, because if you don't reject that claim, then you are no longer claiming that materialism is true. Well, can't you be an atheist without being a materialist? Technically, probably, but probably not consistently, right? Because an atheist believes that there's no higher power. An atheist believes that there is no such thing as God, that believes the affirmative claim that God does not exist. Is it possible to be an atheist and to somehow assert that there's still a supernatural? I suppose. But most atheists are materialists and naturalists, which means that they have to reject the idea of the metaphysical realities that I just talked about the existence of the mind separate from the brain, that the mind is not the brain. That's something that most atheists reject because they're materialists, and all materialists have to reject. But theism actually has a good explanation for this. Under theism, it's not at all surprising that conscious minds exist, because under theism, God is defined as a mind, an unembodied mind. This is what the literature would explain God to be. And if an infinite mind exists, then there's no question, there's no surprise that finite minds exist. In fact, when the scriptures tell us that God made man in his image, not only is it not surprising, but it actually makes sense that we have a mind and it is different than our brain, because God is an unembodied mind who made us in his image. So, premise 1, if God does not exist, then intentional states of consciousness do not exist, or then the conscious mind does not exist. Premise 2, intentional states of consciousness do exist. The conscious mind does exist. Premise 3, therefore God exists. That's what I have for you guys this week. See you next week. God bless. Hey, have you honestly considered supporting us on Patreon yet? Right now, we are about 2/3 of the way through funded to our next goal, which is just $200 a month. And as soon as we hit that, we're going to be doing an in-depth training for all of our patrons on something called the Warrior's Garden. If you don't know what that is, you're going to want to check out our podcast. I have the link in the description so that you can get a sneak peek as to what the Warrior's Garden is and why you're going to want to be a part of that. And all that I need you to do is prayerfully consider supporting us. You can pick one of our tiers, or you can go ahead and make a custom pledge for $3 a month. It's totally up to you. Any and all support helps, and supporting at any level gets you access to all the private things that we do on Patreon. So I'd like to invite you to prayerfully consider supporting us in that way. I love you so much. God bless.